really wanted to move chronologically in this process. So I started in the 70s with Chainsaw, and I discovered the Warren Scarron collection at the Ransom Center. And as I was going through that collection, I also discovered that they have the outtakes from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre there at the Ransom Center. So I sat through 24 hours of outtake footage, a lot of screaming, a lot of Marilyn screaming in those outtakes. It made me rethink a lot of those arguments I was hearing in grad school about being desensitized to violence and how media could do that. I was like, yeah, I actually think it could. And that was really key, actually, finding those outtakes, because if you're at all familiar with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you know it's been written about a lot. It's a very beloved film. It's a very popular film. And so by the time I started interviewing people who were connected with it, if they were still alive, in some ways they were talking about things that I knew maybe were more myth than truth. And so I was sort of struggling with, how do I make this relevant? How do I write about this movie that's been written about so much? And what can I do to make it different? And one of the things the outtakes helped me with is they had the slate, you know, the slate like that, if you don't know what a slate is. And it had the dates. So I was able to sort of piece together a real production history with actual dates. Like, okay, this happened on this day. And so when they talk about the fact that there was a week hiatus, it's like, okay, it happened from this point to this point. And then I was interviewing the cinematographer Daniel Pearl, and he said, you know what? I think if I dig around in my records, I have the old production schedule somewhere. And so one day on my fax machine, this typewritten thing, grid comes through, and it's, you know, a production schedule. And as I say in the book, Tobe Hooper claims, oh, you know, we didn't draw that up. That was something we had to do for the producers to satisfy them, to let them think that we were on a schedule. But it actually does stay pretty true to the outtake material, I found as I did my research. Another important discovery at that point in the process was the financial information, the records, the memos that I found in the Scarron collection. Warren Scarron was helped to create and was the first executive director of the Texas Film Commission, which is based here in Austin. And he was also the behind-the-scenes producer's rep for the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And he really didn't want this to be known. One was worried about the conflict of interest, being head of the Film Commission and also repping this film and trying to find a distributor for it, and not doing that for other films at the time. But he was really ambivalent about this film and what it stood for, and the fact that it was violent and all of those things. And there are these great letters in the collection, you know, not the best film for the head of the Film Commission to be involved with, but oh well, you know, those kinds of letters. But really what was more important to me in finding that collection is that Scarron just kept great records of the financials. And I realized, even though I was sort of terrified to write about this film because it had been written about so much, that was my way in. As much as I'm not a real financial person, it's not one of my strong interests in terms of looking at movies, I realized it was the way in. And I remember coming home from finding that stuff in the collection and telling my husband Paul about it, and sort of saying, yeah, nobody wants to hear about that, right? So I don't need to include that. And he's like, I'd be interested in that. I was like, okay. So I sort of knew I had to deal with this. And that was actually really important because it set the tone for the rest of the book. In addition to including all of the movie's production histories, each chapter includes a box office discussion and also a critical reception of the film. And those two didn't always link up, and also the audience reaction to the film didn't always match with the critical reception of the film. And so I wanted to write about that. And the whole critical aspect, the critical reception, comes out of my interest really in grad school and audience studies. And that's how that all developed. And you know, to this day, the HRC files continue to produce interesting finds. I was there last summer on a fellowship working on what I hope will be my second book, and they have lots of audio tapes that hadn't been digitized yet. And so slowly they've started digitizing them for me as they relate to my next project. And one of the tapes that I listened to was a phone call between one of the principals in the crew on Chainsaw and a police officer in Wisconsin talking about the serial killer Ed Gein. And I have a pretty good idea from the voice of who the person is making the phone call, but he's using a fictitious name, and he's saying at the time, I think this was around '73, during production of Chainsaw, he's saying that he's a psychology student at the University of Texas, and he's doing research on serial killers for his dissertation. And so that's really an interesting find, because the movie has been compared a lot. The character of Leatherface has been compared a lot to Ed Gein, and Tobe Hooper would say, oh, that was an inspiration, and people who worked on the movie was like, he never talked about that, that wasn't an inspiration. So it's just interesting that there's still stuff out there, I guess, and while in a way, when I found it, I was like, why wasn't this here? You know, why didn't I find this a few years ago? It's kind of exciting to me that there's still stuff out there that people haven't found yet.